But no, instead we're going to talk nuclear energy and energy grid and the power problems we have in this country with our next guest, member for Lyne and great advocate for sensible energy policies in this country, David Gillespie. David Gillespie, thank you so much for joining us here on the program today. I want to kick off here by playing a little grab from Mick de Brenni. He is the Queensland Energy Minister, at least for the next few months, talking about something that I think is pretty interesting. Nuclear power versus renewables. Let's have a look at this grab and then take us through what's going through here.
They recently talked about lifting the nuclear moratorium. The threat of nuclear power is a moratorium on your industry, your goals, your plans, and puts its future in jeopardy. And we know the threat is real.
David Gillespie sounded to me like he was telling the renewables energy that the ban on nuclear was about protecting them and not actually providing great power to the Australian people. What do you reckon?
I reckon the cat has been belled. It's out of the bag now. He's officially saying we're going to keep the ban on nuclear energy, which prevents you getting cheap, reliable energy like they've got in Canada, in America, in Europe. Instead, we're going to have subsidies and more subsidies for renewable energy. And to have the energy minister of a state of our commonwealth saying that he's supporting perpetual featherbedding for renewables, people can see why the costs of renewables is putting our bills up. That's just the start of all the stuff they've kept hidden, like the $62 billion black hole in the Gen Cost report. They failed to cover all the costs in what they estimate the cost of electricity from renewables will be by 2030 by hiding $62 billion worth of costs. So I can go through them all, but it just shows you how divisive this is. They should be doing it on economics, physics of electricity, and that is good policy to have reliable baseload as the majority of your system rather than variable weather-dependent electricity.
Yet, David, you, as part of the coalition, have signed up to this net zero madness. The Australian people really don't have a choice when they go to the polls, but there is a push now within the national parties, within the National Party at the federal conference to have a different position, to actually give the Australian people a choice and walk away from net zero. Where do you stand on that? And tell me, will the party make an announcement in the short term saying that you're going to have a different approach? We keep hearing about the coal to nuclear transition, but we're not having a concrete policy position yet.
Yeah, that issue has been discussed and the motions about it were altered by the amendments from people who turned up, who had the right to be there, but they never turn up at other federal conferences. Look, net zero comes with a lot of baggage. People have got to realise it is the standing policy of the coalition, but around the world, in England, in Europe, people are waking up to the consequences of it. Net zero means we're going to have less agriculture because 30% of what they are trying to shut down comes from agriculture. Like Ireland, like Holland, who want to cull 200,000 or a third of their dairy herd because they burp and fart too much, for goodness sake. Covering, areas the size of Victoria, which is what will happen if Australia goes down the net zero model, because we will have to have that amount of agriculture covered with solar panels, wind farms, and up to 28,000 kilometres of unnecessary poles and wires everywhere. Net zero means there will be less intensive heavy industry, because the current plan for Australia involves just using variable renewable energy as the majority of our electricity source. So look, it's got a lot of other bad downsides. We in the Nationals are committed to getting cheap, affordable electricity that is zero carbon, and that is nuclear energy. It is the safest form. It is, when it's deployed at scale, it is very, very cheap. And that's why electricity prices in France and Europe, where they're getting mainly baseload nuclear, is cheaper. And same in Canada and same in America. Any jurisdictions that have a large baseload coming out of nuclear, like France and Ontario, the province in Canada where most of the nuclear plants are, it's very clean energy and it ticks all the boxes, but you can still have an economy. You can still have factories that make stuff. You can reindustrialise. You know, Canada, because they've gone ahead and they're committed to expanding their nuclear fleet, Volkswagen is going over to Canada. It's leaving Germany, where they're running on windmills that only work 20 or 30% of the time, and solar panels that only work 10% of the time in Germany, and they're moving $17 billion worth of investment into Ontario. That tells your message. Now, we've already lost a lot of our manufacturing capability over the last 15, 20 years over exporting our industry to China and India and Vietnam, where they are using all sorts of energy, including nuclear, and we're exporting our so-called dirty industries. But that means we're exporting jobs. We want all the jobs to come back, and cheap, reliable electricity is fundamental to that. But if we keep going on the plan that AEMO has, which is justified by a really faulty Gen Cost report, like I said, even the Gen Cost report, they're just missing $62 billion worth of cost by 2030. They're ignoring the $6 billion every year of federal and other state subsidies. All these costs, they say, you don't have to count that because that's a sunk cost. No, it's a cost that you and I and everyone and taxpayers are paying. So when you look at the real cost of nuclear, even other parts of the Gen Cost report are really faulty. You know, depending on what parameters you put into these models, you can get whatever result you like. Now, they've put the life of a nuclear plant down to 30 years. They last for 60, 80 years. Same for, the costs that operate. That's one of the beauties of operating a nuclear plant, because the fuel is relatively cheap. It's so energy dense, you only have to fuel up the tank every year and a half or two. Whereas a coal plant, an oil plant, it's all the time.
You talk about the costs. The New South Wales government has just announced they're going to spend $800 million just on poles and wires to connect renewable projects to the grid. Do you think the public are awake to all of these sunken costs? I mean, we keep being told renewables are cheap, it's free energy, but the amount of money being thrown around is just extraordinary. Do the public realise, do you think?
I don't think they do. 46% of your bill now that you get for your electricity is not for the actual electricity, it's for transmission and distribution costs.
Wow.
And there are other costs that go into your bill. There's all the green schemes, the cost of the renewable energy target certificates, all the other frequency control, because your grid has got to be tightly controlled at 50 hertz, or that's 3,000 RPM. If it varies from that, it's dangerous. The grid will black out like it does if there's no electricity or there's too much electricity in the grid. All these frequency control things, all the green schemes, all the transmission costs and distribution, which is poles and wires, will be the majority of your electricity costs. Now, we are going to subsidise these grids all over the place. The base case is 10,000 kilometres, but if we're going to the full hydrogen economy that Chris Bowen wants, it's about 28,000 kilometres of poles and wires. Now, they all cost money and they've all got to be paid for. So you'll be paying for it in your bill once they're built, because they get a fixed return.
David, what I want to ask you here then, to put this in very precise, concise terms, the left and the renewable energies people say wind and solar are the cheapest form of getting those electrons to you. What you're saying is the more you put out there, the more you put out in remote parts of the country, the more you have to ship those electrons back into the grid, the more the proportion of your electricity bill that is devoted to poles and wires, that's going to go up, and nobody's going to save any money, and in fact, it's going to be a lot more expensive.
Yes, exactly. What they quote is the standalone cost. Like in the middle of a paddock somewhere down at Goulburn, as you're driving back to Sydney, you've seen them, those big wind farms. the cost of electricity at the bottom of that pole, they do the figures, and putting one pole with a wind turbine up is cheaper than a power station. But to get that electricity, which is direct current, into an alternating current electricity system and transmit it costs heaps, because you've got to build these extra grids everywhere. And same for big solar farms, it doesn't produce AC electricity, it produces DC. So you've got all these other engineering costs that go into it, as well as the poles and wires themselves. And look, if you look at the cost of having solar farm running your electricity at night, which runs cities, or wind farms, you've got to account for that. Now, solar farms and wind farms can't operate unless there's a grid. So they are demanding all these subsidies to build billions and billions of dollars of expensive bits of engineering, so that their investment gets paid a lot of money. You know, people
David,
make money out of electricity. Yep.
I've been talking to farmers, we've been talking to farmers on this station in Victoria who say these transmission lines that are going up to connect the renewables to the grid, it's not just impacting the beauty of the countryside, the aesthetic, it's impacting the way they farm. And they are saying it has a serious threat to our food security because they cannot farm the way they have been. Now, this seems to be a fairly significant issue that seems to have been overlooked. And the Nationals are supposed to represent the regional areas, they're supposed to represent these people. How can we be in this state where we are implementing policies that are going to impact our food security?
Well, exactly. We are objecting. There's plenty of farmers and community groups that don't want these unnecessary extra grids coming through their town, their farm, a blight on the landscape, and they only generate or carry electricity 30% of the time if they're coming from a wind farm, or 20% of the time if they're coming from a solar farm. That's why they've got to have all these hidden subsidies that people aren't aware are built into your electricity cost. But the VNI West one, they've reassessed the cost of it. It's about 11 billion. All the costs of these turn out to be double what they say they're going to be costing. Look at Snowy Hydro 2, it's up to $12 billion and rising. Now, if we go down this renewables only path, we're going to need about 13 Snowy Hydros to back up wind and solar, or you're going to need a couple of $1 trillion worth of batteries to back up wind and solar when we have an East Coast low, because they're doing backup plans for 4 hours or 7 hours. But when we have an East Coast low or a wind drought, you might be out without wind power or solar power for 4, 5, 6, 7 days in a row. So all these extra costs come when you have predominantly renewable energy. Whereas if you have power stations of any sort that are running round the clock as baseload producers, their costs go down, your electricity cost goes down, transmission costs go down. You don't need poles and wires everywhere. You don't need to rip up national parks with wind farms, build pumped hydro schemes. Instead of using water from dams, we're going to use it instead of using it for agriculture, it's going to be trapped in these pumped hydro schemes to make expensive electricity.
David Gillespie, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much for sounding the warning to us, and I can only hope that Chris Bowen and Labor wake up to the threats of blackouts and higher power prices and food insecurity before it's too late.